begin shortly. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending the day 3 of this year's Dismantle Preservation Unconference. It's a pleasure to be your host this week. This event was made free thanks to the generous support of the Alpha Wood Foundation, Eileen and Norman Tyler, and Beavis Impact. Thanks to those organizations, all of these events are free, but you are encouraged to support a philanthropic cause of your choice, or maybe you'll choose to support one of the 5 pre-selected nonprofits at this event. We are encouraging you to support Asian and Pacific Islanders in historic preservation, Latinos in heritage conservation, House of Tulip, the Decay Devils, or the Apache Passion Project. I hope you will consider supporting these nonprofits and their current fundraisers because they are doing valuable work to shift the preservation movement and to support communities in really meaningful ways. I'm really excited for this afternoon's pairing of lightning talks. We have Morgan Vickers and Mina. And these two are going to give back-to-back presentations followed by a moderated Q&A. So feel free to throw your questions into the chat box or into the Q&A box, whichever you prefer. And yeah, hope you really enjoy these talks.
Great, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, hi everyone. My name is Morgan Vickers, and I'm a third-year PhD student in the Department of Geography at UC Berkeley. I'd like to thank Sarah for inviting me to speak at this conference and Mina for sharing this space with me today. My research focuses on Black dispossession and white progress, particularly in relation to federal dam and water projects. In today's talk entitled Unsettling Heritage Preservation and Environmental Transformation, a case study for the Submerged, I'll draw upon my dissertation fieldwork and hopefully I'll raise a few provocations that'll spur a broader dialogue during the Q&A. On August 11th, 1938, the state of South Carolina broke ground on the Santee Cooper Hydroelectric Project, a 170,000 acre dam and reservoir project. Over 27 months, engineers and more than 12,500 New Deal laborers cleared hundreds of thousands of acres of farm and swampland and relocated 901 families from their homes, the majority of whom were Black families living on lands occupied and cultivated by their families for generations. Thereafter, the state of South Carolina erected a 42-mile system of dams and dikes to create Lakes Marion and Moultrie. In the centuries prior to the creation of the reservoirs, the Santee tribe, meaning people of the river, stewarded the land of central eastern South Carolina for centuries prior to European contact, residing, creating, and living alongside the Santee and Cooper rivers. From earliest arrival to 1863, European settlers forcibly brought enslaved Africans with them to the Carolinas or traded slaves across state and county lines. Those brought into the Santee territory were forced to cultivate rice, spending hours each day wading in the murky Carolina swamps and enduring brutal temperatures, abusive masters, and the threat of waterborne disease. Upon emancipation, Black South Carolinians were 8 years in power, building communities, fostering Black institutions, opening up educational opportunities, erecting infrastructure, and holding political office. In the towns that now lie beneath Lakes Marion and Moultrie, Black people largely worked as sharecroppers and tenant farmers, or in some cases, small farm owners. Though white people lived in the community, the towns were largely politically, economically, and socially segregated. And following Reconstruction, Black people in the region were threatened physically through mob violence, beatings, and lynchings, and institutionally through Jim Crow policies, disenfranchisement, and ultimately dispossession by eminent domain. Black memory in Central South Carolina and in this country writ large is threatened through social and institutional historic erasures. Today, few people are aware of the histories, the former residents, or the foreclosed futures of the towns drowned beneath the Santee Cooper Project, or in dozens of other dispossession projects that occurred throughout America in the 20th century. In this talk, I ask, how does the social and literal reinvention of a landscape shape our understanding of who does and who does not belong in those spaces? And how do the spaces we continue to preserve and the stories we can continue to tell shape how we understand whose lives are important and whose heritage deserves to live on? The Santee Cooper Project demonstrates what Mindy Thompson Fullilove calls root shock, a traumatic reaction to involuntary relocation caused by federal, state, and local development initiatives that privilege productivity and progress over existing social and cultural structures. Though Fullilove's root shock is defined as a consequence of urban renewal projects, I expand this concept to think about what we might deem rural renewal, or what Martin Phillips and others have deemed rural gentrification, a process marked by a change in the social composition of an area, with members of middle-class groups replacing working-class residents. In the Santee Cooper Project, the state and federal government seized lands formerly owned and maintained by mostly Black descendants of enslaved peoples, flooded the region and turned the waters into recreational space, then sold waterfront properties to mostly middle and upper income white families. Though 22 plantations were demolished in the creation of the Santee Cooper Project, several were intentionally saved from rising waters or relocated to be preserved away from the reservoirs in the name of heritage preservation. This includes Lawson's Pond Plantation on the left, which among many other preserved plantations is honored on the National Register of Historic Places, and the Hanover House, which you'll see on the right, which was relocated to the Clemson University campus over 250 miles away and served as an icon of the schools and the state's only architecture program for the majority of the 20th century. I want to pause here for a moment to ask what it might mean for Southern students of the past century to learn about the history, significance, and processes of architecture in a preserved plantation house. What ripple effects might the valorization of such a structure have on the architecture and stories that followed? Likewise, today, in their corporate history of the reservoirs, the Santee Cooper Company, which now serves as the state's main power and electric utility company, has redefined the man-made lakes, Marion and Moultrie, as, quote, 160,000 acres of natural paradise, end quote, and seeks to reframe the landscape and communities that preceded the reservoir's creation as, quote, ravaged and diseased, thereby corrupting our understanding of natural and therefore preservable landscapes. The landscape has been reshaped, its new appearance and use favoring water management, hydroelectricity, recreation, and white plantation memory over native ecologies and sites of Black and Indigenous history. The naturalizing language we now use to describe this modified landscape is nothing short of mythologizing. In thinking about the Santee Cooper Project, it is useful to think alongside Macarena Gomez Barris's concept of extractivismo, which indicates an economic system that engages in thefts, borrowings, and forced removals, violently reorganizing social life as well as the land by thieving resources from Indigenous and Afro-descendant territories. I want to emphasize that the creators of the Santee Cooper Project not only participated in a singular extractive event, wherein they removed people through eminent domain, but they continue to participate in extractivismo through the historical erasure of the existence of Black and Indigenous peoples and communities, violently reordering our material and social worlds in the present. Today, the stories told about the dispossessed lives beneath the shores of Lakes Marion and Moultrie privilege whiteness and white property. At the time of dispossession, many Black families were still living in old plantation slave cabins, structures that were well over 100 years old. Historian Douglas W. Bostick, who has written one of the only histories of the Santee Cooper Project, elaborately documented the sunken plantations and the lost white property in the creation of the hydroelectric project, but deemed Blackness and Black loss as insignificant in the project, writing, quote, "Many of the African-American cabins and shacks were not worth saving," end quote. Bostick also notes that, quote, "Progress can be an insatiable monster. The loss of these historic sites and the disruption of our communities and families needs to be recognized." Yet, in his retelling, the only sites worthy of historic recognition are indeed structures and symbols of white supremacy, most notably plantations. To minimize or erase Blackness and indigeneity in our retellings is to perpetuate the myth of whiteness and white property as central to our Southern stories and to our American stories writ large. As debates rage over critical race theory and the history we teach in our classrooms, it's important to recognize that threats to public history and public education extend far beyond the classroom, into our landscapes, infrastructures, neighborhoods, and communities. The issue is not simply a question of the violences and dispossessions that occurred in the past, but how we frame them, what we choose to preserve, and what we naturalize in the present and into the future. As Richard Sheen writes, landscapes are always in the process of becoming, continually under scrutiny, at once manipulable and manipulated, always subject to change, and everywhere implicated in the ongoing formulation of social life. I implore us in the field of preservation to unsettle heritage preservation, to interrogate the landscapes around us, to ask whether the histories and the worlds we have preserved honor the difficulty of the past and the dreams of the future. More significantly, how can we right the wrongs of preservationists, architects, academics, community planners, and more who came before us? And how can we put the decisions, the direction, and the dreams of conservation in the hands of people this field has historically and presently dispossessed, dismissed, and in the case of the Santee Cooper Project, drowned? Is it even possible to preserve or narrativize our way out of these historical and historic wrongdoings? Perhaps, as this conference title suggests, the only way to begin healing is simply to dismantle preservation. Thank you.
Thank you, Morgan. Nina?
Hello, just give me 1 second. All right, hi, my name is Mina Marar, and I'm a recent graduate of Georgetown University and an incoming law student at UC Davis in California. I completed my senior thesis on historic preservation through the American Studies program, where I was able to focus on one specific neighborhood in DC, Berry Farm. Today, I'm proud to present on my thesis and foster some thoughtful conversation. The title is Historical Not Historic, Destabilizing Historic Preservation Through the Redevelopment of Berry Farm. Now, before I get into too many details, I want to center us briefly. When you walk through the streets of a predominantly white neighborhood, it's not unusual to see countless Black plaques discussing something historical that occurred at a street corner or a park. Each and every one of those countless plaques represents something that has officially been deemed historic. As a country, it's clear that we have a deep investment in memorializing certain aspects of American history. In fact, the entirety of the Georgetown neighborhood in DC has been deemed a historic district, along with some of the buildings inside it. But just 10 miles from there, Berry Farm dwellings lies half demolished, with only 32 buildings remaining in what used to be a 444-unit public housing complex. Berry Farm has no plaque, has no formal historic landmark, but I can assure you it is historic. Just to give some brief history on the area, Berry Farm Dwellings was originally purchased by the Freedmen's Bureau after the Civil War. The 1940s marked its first existence as a public housing complex, later creating a deep sense of community and tenant organizing. The picture on the right shows the plaintiffs involved in a Supreme Court case called Bowling v. Sharp that ended segregation in DC alongside Brown v. Board of Education. Key figures such as Etta Mae Horn of the National Welfare Rights Organization also came out of those same streets, and the list of prominent individuals and events from Berry Farm could go on forever. But for the last 15 years, Berry Farm tenants have been battling the city's redevelopment plans to convert the sacred historic public housing complex into a mixed income development meant to raise rents and drive tenants out. In 2019, the Berry Farm tenants decided to apply for a historic designation in an attempt to save the rest of their neighborhood from being demolished. Anyone would think that Berry Farm would be deserving of a historic landmark or a plaque at the least. The Historic Preservation Review Board and National Park Service, however, disagreed. The stucco-clad walls don't look the way they once did. In my thesis, I used Berry Farm as a case study to discuss how historic preservation functioned as a narrowly defined entity steeped in respectability politics, ultimately costing so many tenants their homes and their tight-knit community. In DC, an applicant will go through a process with the Historic Preservation Review Board, which is made up of about 9 DC community members. After submitting an application, the review board holds a hearing in which they give their final judgment after listening to testimony. Essentially, when a prospective applicant is seeking a historic designation, they must categorize their narrative into one of four criterion: event, person, design and construction, or information potential. In the case of Berry Farm, the main criterion used was criterion A, event. And the process of proving this results in a long narrative chock full of historical facts and primary sources dedicated to showing why that property is associated with the past. The second main aspect of historic preservation is historic integrity, which is ultimately what disqualified Berry Farm. What's essential to note here is that this is based on the current state of the buildings. So if we take a look here, there's a side-by-side comparison of Berry Farm in 1940 to Berry Farm today. At first glance, it's obvious that there's a demolished part of the neighborhood. But the other details you might not notice is the change in the roofing, the walls, and the doors. The original material of exposed concrete block was converted to thick stucco, covering up a lot of the brickwork that was indicative of public housing at the time it was first built. At the official hearing in July of 2019, the Historic Preservation Office presented their report evaluating the integrity within Berry Farm. Basic characteristics regarding the physical placement of the buildings were deemed intact, such as location, setting, and association. But on the other hand, the Preservation Office also testified that Berry Farm lost aspects of integrity, such as design, material, workmanship, and feeling, due to the minor changes listed on the previous slide, as well as the overall deteriorated state of the buildings. This quote right here, to some extent, is the crux of my thesis and my title. Kim Williams from the Preservation Office says, "We do not question at all the historic significance or importance of Berry Farm. However, the surviving rows of housing have been altered and in poor condition and lack the physical integrity required." Essentially, Williams is saying that yes, Berry Farm is historical. However, it is not historic, as in it does not qualify to be deemed as permanently and officially relevant to American society. This detail is so minute, but ultimately what cost the tenants a full designation. And with this testimony, it was like a dark reality loomed that Berry Farm would be remembered as an almost, or a forced building block on the way to a better future. In addition to these stringent rules, though, also comes the power dynamics that are entrenched in every part of the preservation process. This leads to the second issue I grappled with, respectability politics. I define this as the expectation for applicants to comport themselves in a palatable, proper way, the need for a unified community experience, or the expectation to share vulnerable, traumatic stories in a public setting. Originally, the Berry Farm tenants were discouraged from submitting an application to the review board because the state historic preservation officer didn't think their story was even worth the battle. In 2019, however, the tenants didn't give up and ultimately brought a team of over 30 people to a tiny courtroom in the middle of DC. Only at this point were the tenants taken a little bit more seriously, once they had shared their vulnerable stories. This quote from David Maloney illustrates the type of respectability politics placed upon the tenants, because David is the first person to have discouraged them, and only now, after hearing their testimony, has he began to take them just a little bit more seriously. He says, "The Tenants Association did an excellent job of turning out their supporters, and they came in and argued very much. Also, their nomination did do more research than we had available at the time of our initial conversation." So in order to gain any sort of credibility, it placed this expectation upon the tenants to share a vulnerable, unified story that was palatable and eloquent enough to believe. It's concerning to see that one of the few key individuals in a preservation process can use such a patronizing tone to describe applicants and even dissuade them from applying in the first place. But with all this effort, each testimony still feels impenetrable to the previous quote from Kim Williams. Because at the end of the day, it didn't matter how many people shared their story, no testimony could change the historic integrity or lack thereof of the buildings and the property. Finally, in January of 2020, the review board ultimately decided to designate 50 units total. This decision came out of a series of meetings between the developers, the review board, the preservation office, and the tenants. Essentially, the review board felt bad and wanted to let the tenants win something, ultimately giving them much more of a commemorative prize of such a small corner in the originally proposed area. Well, I just spent so long discussing how rigid the expectations were for historic preservation and integrity, it's clear that the rules can be bent. So the larger question is, does this even count as a success? Because as you can see in the excerpt of this quote, the review board is prioritizing redevelopment. And when I talk to multiple tenants, the answer of whether or not is a success is very mixed. But at the end of the day, each conversation I had ended with an overwhelming desire to go back home. To ask ourselves if the tenants' hopes are even met, and if this concession of 50 units is even a success. So with that context in mind, this quote from Sarah Schoenfield, the local historian who helped fill out the application, illuminates some of these complexities further. She says, I would say that this process was not particularly successful. Stopping displacement is really not the goal of historic preservation. It's to preserve buildings, not communities. So how do you define success in a process that wasn't made to work in the first place? Whose goals do you choose to maintain at the forefront? One of the most interesting conversations I had was with Detrice Belt, the president of the Berry Farm Tenants and Allies Association. When I asked her how she described the goal of the campaign, she said she'd hoped to find a way to preserve both the past and the present. It immediately made me take a step back and consider what that outcome would look like, because at the core, attempting to preserve both the past and the present is contradictory. With a process as stringent as the current one, the focus is 100% on convincing the key players that the current state of the building represents the past enough. But then where does the present go? And that's exactly what the crux of the current issue with Berry Farm. In thinking about historic preservation, we must question what it means that sometimes it's the last resort people have to try and save their houses from redevelopment. We need to think about we decide to memorialize and why. Think about what history is represented, and think about who gets to decide. Thank you.
Thank you, Morgan and Mina. I really appreciated both of your talks. We're going to start with a question from Megan. Megan says, it seems like colonial aesthetic bias has been a major factor in continually suppressing recognition of African American sites. Did the panelists see a way forward in moving away from this bias in the broader community as well as among preservation academics?
My short answer is no, I don't yet see a way forward. I think I'm still grappling with the implications of the actions of the past. I think Mina sort of hit on this with the question, how do you define success in a process that was not meant to work in the first place? And I guess maybe this is sort of like the crux of this conference, but I guess I'm responding to this question with a question, which is like, how is it even possible to preserve our way out of this preservation problem that we've created? Because at least in my field site, the town no longer exists. The sites of Black history no longer exist. And so there's no way we can undrown these historic sites. And so I guess, and this sort of speaks back to what Mina was talking about, which is really interesting. Thank you for sharing, Mina. I think if this was not designed to, like if preservation was not designed to preserve communities, at least in the way you were talking about, Mina, like what is, I don't know, I guess I'm sort of grappling with this question myself. How can we preserve a building to better situate this community? I don't yet see a way that it's possible.
Well, I think what I thought about during this thesis process was sort of the difference between the house and the home, and how, you know, the house is understood as the physical exterior of a building. And so it's easy to try and preserve that and think of history in that way. But in my opinion, I think what actually makes something history are the people that did it. So that's the home part. And I think that is sort of the part that's missing from historic preservation, because it's so dependent on these specific details of whether or not the bricks are in the same place from how they were first built. And the matter of the fact is, it's so much easier for wealthier neighborhoods to preserve that. But in a community like Berry Farm, where it's all public housing, they don't even actually have the ability to control renovation on it. You know, that's the DC government's job. So I think, I mean, luckily for me as an undergrad, I didn't have to come up with a solution in my thesis, but I think there needs to be a more comprehensive understanding of what history means, but also a way for redevelopment to be more mindful of what it's redeveloping. Because I think that in the situation at Berry Farm, historic preservation was really only used as a way to stop redevelopment. So I think, you know, that's just a separate category of how preservation's used.
It seems like one of the barriers that both of you are encountering is the way preservation constructs currently exist. They don't overlap a ton with public history. They don't overlap a ton with the intangible. So the constructs just inherently prioritize the house over the home, you know, as Mina said. So, I mean, yeah, we're all grappling with this, but it really, I think, speaks volumes, the fact that we have the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and then we have the National Council on Public History. Why don't these overlap? Isn't it a Venn diagram? We have a question from Marion. Hi, Morgan and Mina. These are amazing presentations. Morgan, I liked your last question. Is it even possible to narrativize and preserve our way out of this wrongdoing? Could you expand on your thoughts? And Mina, expand on what this might mean for historic preservation's future. So is there a way, even if we don't have the tangible, or even if it's quote unquote lost its integrity, as you are exploring, you know, what do you think the potential out of the box or non-traditional preservation strategies could be?
Yeah, I think, I guess what I was alluding to in this question is, I mean, I work in preservation right now, and I'm also an academic. And I think a lot of conversations that I've been having in sort of like my preservation spheres has been, okay, what can we preserve that we haven't preserved in the past? How can that right the wrongs? And a lot of the conversations that I'm having in academic circles are sort of like, how can we tell different stories to right the wrongs? And I sort of tried to get at this in my talk, which is, the issue is not necessarily, for me at least, going back and changing what happened or changing the story, or, I mean, I think broadening the story helps, but I don't know that like re-narrativizing or like newly narrativizing what happened or newly preserving things is going to get us out of this hole. And I think, like, I guess thinking through an abolition mindset or thinking through like a dismantling preservation mindset, okay, what other tools can we use to right these historic wrongs and historicized wrongs, and then think forward to how we sort of want this field to look if we want it to exist. And that's what I was getting at with that question. In terms of what that might look like, I mean, I think maybe you were alluding to this earlier, Sarah, but I think because my project is focusing on a community that no longer exists, I'm often thinking about the intangibles and how we can think about that which doesn't exist. And I think, like, for me, oral histories have been super important in this process. There aren't a lot of existing archival records of these communities. There's no material record unless I go and scuba dive down to the bottom of this lake. And so I'm thinking about like how to understand community in the absence of place, and what would it mean to make a new place, or think about place as not just what was once there or what could have been there or what we can keep there for X amount of time.
So I have to assume, as an alumni of Chapel Hill, it is a great contemporary showcase of what you're saying in terms of abolition, and just telling the story isn't enough. And like, I'm just thinking of the sculpture being removed and then the institution reemplacing it, or Nicole Hannah Jones being denied tenure and then having to deny. Do do you see something like comparable in the preservation sphere where it's one step forward, two steps back? Is that how you're kind of feeling as you're navigating this process?
Yes, kind of. I mean, I can't harken a specific example, but I think like a lot of the language I'm seeing in the preservation world, and as I've worked with the trust for the past 3 years, the National Trust, a lot of the conversations I've been seeing have been like telling a broader story, telling a fuller story. And I feel like there is a tension in academia and in public history and in preservation between like, especially when you have like corporate funders or something like that. Like, what stories are we allowed to tell? What stories do we need to tell? But like, what must we leave out in order to continue to get public funding? And this is like the public education question too. And this is why I alluded to the like critical race theory conversations. I think like in these historic institutions as in like the field of preservation and in academia, but also like institutions as in specific schools like UNC or specific preservation organizations, I think we unfortunately aren't acting independently. Like, we have all these other factors we have to consider in order to tell these full stories, and even those stories right now are limited. And so I don't yet know the way out, but I mean, I can think of a few organizations outside of preservation who are doing like a lot of really interesting imaginative work that allows us to think outside of the institutions we have created for ourselves at this point in time.
Thank you for that. You know, Latoya brings up that she loves that you brought up the issue of wealth and money in order to preserve quote unquote historic buildings and how exclusive the approach is. When the DC Landmarks Commission was encouraging redevelopment of the site, were they bringing forth financial incentives? Were they saying what type of redevelopment they want? What, you know, like, what do you think was their impetus for saying that was necessary, you know?
Well, Berry Farm has been one of the main like redevelopment sites for DC since 2006. Like, they've been trying to make it into this new mixed income development for so long. But I think what was really interesting to me was at the hearing in 2019, a representative from DC Housing Authority was being like interviewed by one of the board members, and he asked her like, you know, why the buildings were crumbling for the last 2 years, because she was saying like the doors are falling off the hinges, the infrastructure is like so messed up, like we need to redevelop it. And so he was like, okay, well, you're in charge of this building, so like, how'd you let it happen? And she said, oh, we just didn't have the money to spread it across all of our properties. And so we just like physically couldn't take care of this neighborhood. And he said, well, okay, so sure, you redevelop it, but how do we know that's not going to happen again in 20 years where you just don't have the money to take care of like this one specific neighborhood? So, I mean, I think it's so complicated because like the DC government kind of knew they wanted to redevelop this site from the beginning, that they were like, well, if we just pretend we don't have the resources to fix your door hinges, it'll make it easier to convince people that it's in such bad condition. And that's the other complicated part of it, is like some tenants wanted to live in rundown houses. Like, they also wanted their houses to be fixed. But it's just really easy to find a loophole and say, oh yeah, let's redevelop it, but we're not going to find a way for you to get back into the neighborhood. So it's just complicated because it forces these tenants to be in a position where they have to be like against improving their like neighborhood, when they didn't even like let the neighborhood get that bad to begin with. I don't know if that answered the question, but
Oh, I think it's great. It harkens back to the mass housing panel discussion yesterday. We had Cheryl, who's a resident of public housing in Chicago. She was like, I've lived here since the 1960s. I've seen the city remove the high school. I've seen the city systematically remove their investment for the neighborhood, and now they're shocked when we don't want to leave, but this is our home. So yeah, it makes sense. It's a multi-layered systematic devaluation of people's communities. I would love for final remarks from both of you. Maybe we can start from Morgan. Your remarks can be, where do you think we all should be looking? Like Morgan already said, there's some groups outside of preservation that are doing interesting work. Or if you all think, where could we learn further about these histories that you both presented today? Or if you just want to leave us with a tidbit of food for thought, anything would be great.
Yeah, I first want to say thank you to both of you for sharing space with me. I think one thing that I'm really thinking about in my own work, and that Mina brought up, is this quote about an overwhelming desire to go back home. And I keep thinking about this homecoming in the absence of community because of these development or redevelopment projects. And so I guess I mentioned this in my talk, but I'm really just imploring people in preservation or in academia to think about what preservation means, what preservation is doing, if it is sustainable, and if it is benefiting the communities we are purporting to support. I think it's just, for me and all of my work, questions of home and questions of belonging are really central. And I think this is a non-tangible project, but I think just talking with people about what home means to them, centering their home and not our beliefs as to what their home should be or what it should look like. And I guess to just keep asking questions. This is really making my brain sort of turn right now. And I wrote down a ton of questions for my own work here. So yeah, thank you for just sharing space with me.
Nina?
Yeah, thank you, both of you as well, for such an interesting conversation. And Morgan, I agree with you on, what you mentioned earlier about oral history. I think the other issue with historic preservation is that it comes from such a superior angle where it's we know what history is important and what we want to preserve, but so often the people who are actually living that are just totally written out. And I think there needs to be more of a push to actually talk to the tenants, listen to the stories. There are tenants in Berry Farm that have been living there for 40, 50 years that have seen so much happen. And of course, the community itself can try to sustain that, but we should have that written down somewhere. We should have that recording somewhere. So I think for me, the future of historic preservation looks like putting more resources in different understanding of history and more of a community lens. And also just making the language of historic preservation more accessible. It took me a year to figure out all these laws, and I can't imagine what it was like for tenants to sit in a hearing and not really understand all the intricacies. So making it more accessible.
Oh, thank you both for that. I know that I'll end up rewatching this presentation because you've given us ample food for thought, and I really appreciate that. If you all in the audience are interested in diving more into affordable housing and retaining housing for people at all income levels, at 5 p.m. Eastern, there will be a panel discussion on just that. And I hope you all will choose to join in. At 4 p.m. Eastern, we have back-to-back talks, a couple more lightning talks. One is on Cats of Brutalism, a fun Instagram account to raise awareness for what is arguably the least likable architecture style. And then also preserving skate parks. So again, preserving community spaces and moving beyond the house into the home. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here today, for Morgan and Mina, for your thoughtfulness. I really appreciate you being here with us today, and I hope everybody continues to figure out how they can dismantle preservation.